little brief introduction, I would love it. Matt, if you can introduce yourself a little bit and go down the line.
Sure, absolutely. Can everyone hear me? Great.
Yeah.
My name is Matt Ward. I've worked in Democratic politics for 14 years, and when I say that out loud, it sounds like a very long time, believe me. Originally from Sacramento, actually, that's my hometown. Got started doing Assembly Member Dave Jones back then, statewide insurance commissioner. Moved on, did San Francisco mayor, LA City Council, and then moved out to New York, where I've spent the last 12 years doing local politics, state and federal, working ultimately for the DCCC, then moved on to Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, almost all congressional work, and then independent expenditure work in California, Jimmy Gomez, Los Angeles, Lou Carvajal in Santa Barbara. So, my background is working as a GC, ultimately running tight races and really focusing on minority groups in inner cities and looking to build votes and ultimately create wins.
Testing. No, works. So, my name is Tin Ho. I'm the elected district attorney of Sacramento County, and so I want to tell you that before I was elected last year into this position and took over in January, I had never run for a single thing in my life, not even class secretary. So for the high school students here in this room, you can do anything you want in life. So I want to tell you that, and I'll tell you this brief story about myself. I was actually born in Vietnam, escaped Vietnam when I was a child on a fishing boat, and spent months in a refugee camp in Malaysia. And when I came to the U.S., I couldn't understand a single word of English. I learned how to speak English by watching Bugs Bunny cartoons. 22 years later, graduated from law school. And so now I am only one of 5 elected district attorneys in the entire country out of 2,400 that look like me. So I want you to remember that for a moment. And I'm talking to the young people in here. You can do anything you want in this life. Have a goal and a vision. And we'll talk more today about what we're seeing coming up in the future. But what I see in terms of the future, it's not the people up on the stage, but it's you.
I'm this first, right? It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and to be back. I'm Lan Chen. I ran for state controller last year here in California, and wasn't successful, but it was a great experience. Managed to win more votes than any other Republican in the country last year, including a guy named Ron DeSantis, who I guess is running for president now. So I like to give him a hard time about that. But it was a great experience. Obviously, I had run for something before, unlike Tien. I ran for student body president when I was a freshman in high school. But that was pretty much it. I hadn't run for anything else either. And so it was a great experience. It's obviously a tremendously interesting state to run in. Have the support of a lot of people here, and I'm very grateful for that. So happy to talk a little bit about the experience I had, but about what else is going on. Before that, I spent a long period of time advising a series of different candidates and administrations. Served in Barack Obama's administration, served in George W. Bush's administration, and have played a number of different appointed roles in government. And as was alluded to, I teach at Stanford and have gone back there after my campaign. So I'm on the faculty there, and I teach public policy and law, which is my background.
Thank you for the introduction. Matt, can you lead us off by telling us kind of, since you're visiting from New York, give us an idea of what you see nationally coming up in 2024. What particular things are you paying attention to, and why do you think it is going down that particular road?
Very expansive question. The thing that I immediately start off thinking about 2024 is the 2022 midterms and exactly how Democrats ended up in the position that they did, which was very not foreseen, right? So, there's a concept called thermostatic voting behavior. Basically, that's where you have one party wins the presidency, and the midterm that follows the next year or 2 years is a party flip, right? That the opposing party takes control of the legislature. And usually this is done by a fairly large margin. You remember the 93, 94 takeover of Newt Gingrich, right? Contract with America. That's one of the ones that I remember when I was a child, growing up. And then this happened every midterm successively following a presidential win. But this time it didn't happen, at least not with the margins that we thought. And my thought is, can those effects happen in 2024? Can we double down on that as a party? And the reason why we think that happened was because you had a non-elected body passing huge radical policy changes in the form of the overturning of Roe. Now we see affirmative action having happened, right? So, what that produced effectively was in very tight races at the gubernatorial level, what's called down ballot defection or split ticket voting, right? And that's where you've got Republican votes for the Republican governor, but then flips to a House race down ballot. Message discipline, correct allocation of resources, but taking advantage of these gifts that were being given through these Supreme Court decisions is something that we need to really think about. So, talking about Roe, talking about affirmative action, right? These things are immensely going to help Democrats in 2024. And then in the 3 critical Senate races that we're looking at, Sherrod Brown, Joe Manchin, and John Tester, I think probably the top 3 right now. The House margins again, I should actually admit with some humility that New York really messed up the House. Sorry about that. We tried to go for a very aggressive map. It didn't work, and now we have Santos. But anyways, that's all going to change. I assure you, in 2024. So again, a lot of the same thinking with the House. I know a lot of people like to speculate about what's going to happen with former President Trump and his trials and the Republican nominating contests, and if he does emerge as the nominee, but he's been convicted, what does that mean? These are highly unusual times. Like, nobody ever thought this was going to happen. And to what extent does a Joe Biden at the top of the ticket drag down all of these down ballot races, right? I think we can all pretty much agree that if Trump is the nominee, that a general electorate is going to be hard pressed to vote for someone that is potentially convicted at that point. Joe Biden has an amazing, I think, record. He's done an amazing job in a very difficult economic climate. Basically reversing largely the effects of inflation. Adding 13 million jobs, so on and so forth, right? But America loves a young, strong leader, right? And here we are with someone that is nearing the twilight of their years, right? So it remains to be seen what that ultimate general election contest looks like. Something that we're all going to be watching fairly closely. So,
thank you, Lonnie. What about you from a Republican perspective? What are you tracking based on what Matt said? And what did you expect? Kind of the Democrats to win as many seats as they did in our last election. Do you expect that to happen in 2024? What are you looking at?
Yeah, I think presidential election years always are a little bit more challenging in a lot of different ways, because what you have is you tend to have turnout that doesn't look anything like it does in the midterm year. So if you look at the turnout in the election I ran in last year versus what we're going to see in 2024, it's going to be dramatically different numbers, right? We had, I think, 11.5 million statewide voting in my election last year. And that number is probably going to be significantly larger in 2024. So it makes it a lot harder, I think, to predict. And I think some of it will come down to who the Republican nominee is. And if it's Donald Trump, I think it's going to be very difficult for a lot of down-ticket Republicans to be successful in areas where the differences are very narrow. So Orange County is a good example of that. In Orange County, there's a couple of congressional seats, northern part of San Diego County, that then become, I think, much more challenging for Republicans. Whereas if it's not Trump, if it's someone else, if it's Ron DeSantis or Tim Scott or some other Republican candidate, then I think those seats become much more winnable in a lot of ways, because you don't have the same level of polarization that comes from having as polarizing a figure on the ballot. So I think those are all things to watch for. In my mind, it's every election will have its share of surprises. So when we talk about what was surprising in 22 and what did or didn't happen, there'll be things we'll be talking about in 2024 that no one foresaw and that no one really was able to predict. But fundamentally, the one thing we do know is that political interest tends to be a lot higher in presidential election years, and that impacts a lot of people down ballot. I mean, I'm not running for anything in 2024. I made that decision relatively recently. I just didn't see, first of all, anything I really felt strongly about, but second of all, anything that was particularly competitive, where it would make sense for me to run. And so part of that's a function of, again, what we think the election is going to look like this year versus what the 2022 electorate and then what the 2026 electorate will look like, which is different again from 24 and a lot of us in 22. So you have to take each election on its own merits and see what happens, but there's just going to be a lot of interest, I think, and we live in a very polarized time.
Well, since this panel is kind of titled "Looking into the Crystal Ball," who's your prediction for the Republican nominee, presidential nominee?
Yeah, I mean, it's
how will based on going forward and to what happens in
I mean, it's August, and so that's relatively early, right? Because if you were to think back to 2016, you would have had nominee Jeb Bush. If you were thinking back to 2012, I spent many years of my career working very closely with Mitt Romney. I ended up as his chief policy advisor during that period of time, and you may not have had Mitt Romney as a nominee of the Republican Party if you were looking at the numbers at this point. So I think it's hard to tell. But one thing I know for sure is that there are intrinsic advantages that Donald Trump has as a former president and as the former leader of the Republican Party that give him a significant advantage over others who want to be in that position. And I just think that those are things that are built up over many years. And the one thing that he has that no one else has is what I call a very hard floor. In other words, there are a percentage of people who will vote for him regardless of the circumstances. And it's enough to win a Republican primary. It's 25, 30, 35%, depending on what you look at, of the Republican electorate. That's enough to win the Republican nomination. So if you were to go to Las Vegas tomorrow and someone were to just say to you, look, you have to put a bet down on someone, you would be foolish to not bet on Donald Trump, because I think that's just the nature of how the electorate looks right now. It could change between now and January. A lot of things could happen. The legal stuff, there's just any number of different things. But at this point, if you were to ask me to say who it is, I think it will be Trump. And I think that is not a particularly unique guess, but it's one that is supported by all the data I've seen and all of the conversations that I've had. And I have a lot of conversations with people around the country, and that's my sense of where things are.
Matt, is there a preference from the Democratic Party as to who the Republican nominee is for the 2024 midterms and the 2026 election? And how do you feel about it? Give us a brief layout.
I think the preference is Donald Trump, without question. I think that Trump brings a host of liabilities to the table that are very unique to him and his performance in his first term in office. I think that a large part of this, it's very unusual times we live in. His Mar-a-Lago documents trial case has been set for May of 2024. I think that'll put him just before the nominating convention for that run contest. So if we had to pick as a party out of the field, would it be Tim Scott? Would it be any of those guys? It would definitely be Trump, for sure.
Tim, what are some issues that are kind of closer to home that you've been monitoring? What are some issues that affect Sacramento, California? What have you heard from your constituents regarding things and issues that they really care about?
So let me ask you guys this. Before I give you some poll numbers, and you guys can speak up, what do you think is the number one issue in California? Anybody? Yes?
Cost of living, housing, stuff like that.
Housing, cost of living. Anything else among voters? Yes?
Homelessness and the environment.
Homelessness and the environment. Anybody else? Yes, sir?
Public safety.
Public safety. All right. So there's some recent polling that I was able to see. The number one issue at 83% was homelessness. And number two, at 82% was public safety. And so I asked the pollster, hey, are these numbers high? And he said, look, if I were to ask people right now to look out the window and tell me that the sky is up, you wouldn't get numbers as high as that. That's how high those numbers are. So whether it is in fact a public safety issue, that crime has increased, whether or not it's hate crimes against Asian Americans, whether those numbers are up, it's the perception that people have of those issues now, especially in the major metropolitan areas of LA, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, Sacramento. And so at least locally in Sacramento, we have more homeless people in Sacramento than in San Francisco. So these are the number one issues that people are facing daily. So when you're talking about local races, whether there are mayoral races, so there's going to be a mayor race down in San Diego, in Sacramento. There's going to be a district attorney race down in LA with George Gascon, and another race in San Francisco County there. These things are going to play hugely in those communities, especially locally. And so those are some of the issues that I grapple with as the district attorney. The district attorney, for some of our younger people here, I'm the highest law enforcement official of the county. So I'm in charge of whether or not we file, whether or not we prosecute in any criminal case. So there is an intersection there between the DA's office and a lot of these issues here. And so we're at the forefront of it. And those are issues that we're grappling with in Sacramento. We're grappling with in Santa Clara County, in San Francisco, in Oakland, in LA, in San Diego. So those are the issues that are going to play hugely in those communities right now and in next year, and I think for the next few years to come.
Yeah, and I would love for you to share with the audience here some of the innovative things that you are now doing to combat that particular issue. And I don't think it's being done by anyone else in this entire country. Can you share with us kind of what you're doing about that?
So most definitely, when it comes to homelessness, first of all, we should never criminalize homelessness. But public safety is an issue not only for the unhoused, but the housed as well, right? So there's a study out there, and multiple studies, that talk about in terms of those that are chronically homeless. Chronically homeless is somebody who's been homeless for over a year. 80% or 8 out of 10 of those that are chronically homeless are facing mental health and substance abuse disorder issues. And so when we're talking about, first we have to have shelter. We have to have affordable housing. Those are definitely factors. If you can prevent homelessness on the front end of it, you're going to be in a much better position. So we need more affordable housing, more shelter, emergency and transitional shelter. Absolutely. But for the most treatment resistant in the chronically homeless community, we have to have a mental health and substance abuse approach to it. So some of the things that we're talking about long term. So Governor Newsom is proposing a ballot initiative, $4.4 billion to expand by 10,000 behavioral health beds. There's a RAND study that shows that we are in need of 6,000 behavioral health beds. And he's proposing 10,000 that we're adding to it. He's also looking at in terms of expanding the Mental Health Services Act so that we can take some of that money and use it for mental health. The other thing is there's SB 43, is a Senate bill that talks about conservatorship. If you ever walk downtown in any major city, you see somebody who's homeless, who's unhoused. They're defecating on themselves, they're talking to themselves. They are having a crisis, whether it's because of drugs, a new synthetic form of methamphetamine, or whether it's because of mental health. You see them having a crisis. We need treatment. We need required treatment in the conservatorship law. But it's very hard to get required treatment. And this bill that is being promoted by a Senate Democrat is trying to expand that to include mental health. But here's another piece that I am working on as well. So let's say you own private property, right? Let's say, Don, you own private property, and you allow drug dealing, you allow crime, you allow illegal dumping, you allow fires to happen on your property, crime to occur. What the city is going to do is they're going to send you a notice saying, Don, you need to clean up your property, you need to deal with it. We're going to go after you civilly and criminally for creating a public nuisance. And they create a survey, a form that they send out to the community asking how your property has affected them. That's what they would do. So in Sacramento County, like I said, we in the city in particular, we've had more homeless people, a 250% increase in the last 6 years. 250% increase in 6 years. And in the last year, I've documented 86 incidents around the courthouse in my office. I had an employee assaulted the other day. I had another employee assaulted. I had an employee that was Muslim wearing traditional headwear, and she was threatened with a hate crime. I had a court reporter assaulted. And so what I am doing is I've sent a notice to the city of Sacramento because they are not enforcing the city codes and city ordinances to take care of the public safety issue. And I've told them, you need to clean it up, you need to help us. And just the other day, I sent out a survey. I took the city's survey that they use against private citizens, and I expanded it. And I sent it out. I've had over 1,000 responses from the community in a matter of 3 days. 1,000 responses, that's unprecedented. Talking about how a soccer game of little girls playing soccer had to be postponed because they found needles in the field. A woman experiencing PTSD because she was being held at gunpoint and being robbed from an encampment across the street, and she had to move out of her house. And so I told the city of Sacramento essentially, in no uncertain term, that if they do not deal with this in terms of a compliance issue and then creating emergency shelter, that they are subject to being sued by the district attorney's office. And because of that, they have recently started gearing up on it. And so it's an approach that nobody else is doing, but I am putting maximum pressure on the city to take care of this on multiple levels, shelter and compliance. And so nobody else is doing it, but they're feeling the pressure.
The DA is now prosecuting the city of Sacramento to ensure.
Not yet, not yet.
Quite a revolutionary
It's a different approach.
yeah. So thank you for that. Lonnie, 2024 coming up, do you see any particular issues germane to the API community? And what are those? Can you discuss some of these with us?
Yeah, I think that from my experience, a lot of the issues that Tim talked about, I think are issues that are of interest to the Asian community, and I think beyond. Certainly public safety issues are things we hear about all the time. I think the economy is interesting because if you look at the objective measures of the economy, things look very good. I don't know that people feel very good. So there's this interesting gap between what is portrayed and how people feel about their personal economic conditions. I think there's a significant amount of economic insecurity still. So I think that's another issue. And then I think education is an issue that I hear a lot about when I'm talking to people, and that takes many different forms. I think on the education issue, it's everything from the quality of education being provided in a local school district, issues around freedom of expression in schools. That's something that I think a lot of people are concerned about. I think in some parts of the state, in some parts of the country, parents feel like they've been shut out of some of those decisions, and there's a little bit of tension there. And then I think on the broader issue of affirmative action, I think there's a lot of disagreement, frankly, within the community about how that issue cuts. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are strong differences of opinion. Probably even in this room, there are strong differences of opinion regarding that issue. So I think all of these are salient. I don't necessarily think that there are a set of issues that are like Asian American issues and a set of issues that's everyone else's issues. I actually think that the issues our community cares about are very similar to the issues that the broader set of voters, whether it's in California or beyond, care about. So I think it's all the issues you would expect that are relevant, but certainly the ones that we have seen play out with some level of significance. I think public safety and the economy are two that clearly are very, very significant in California.
Great. Matt, my question to you is this: when we talk about these particular issues and elections coming up in 2024, everything that's germane to our public safety or health and everything else, and we talk about issues that may specifically apply to Asian Americans, Asian American candidates, affirmative action issues, so forth. In your experience, how active is the Asian American community when it comes to voting and actually making a difference? I talked to Jennifer, who's here. She said she lives in a district that's 30% Asian, 5% Black, and she's running for office. But you know what? I'd love to know how many of those 30% of Asians that live in that district is going to come out and vote. What's your experience been?
Yeah, well, I can't speak to California 12's voting behavior within the Asian electorate. It's getting better. Historically, it's been underperforming. Certainly, democratic instincts, voting behavior typically doesn't manifest itself until the first generation with immigrant communities writ large. totally agree with Lonnie's assessment about the types of issues that are important to Asian American voters. Again, API is a very broad definition, right? But children, meaning education, success, financial sustainability, public safety, all definitely top of the list in terms of that thinking. We launched a 501c4 in 2021 in New York City called the API Democracy Project. It was actually focused on creating API voter engagement in that cycle. Chinese mainly and Korean communities. We found a generational approach worked best, right? So, children that were going to schools or had already graduated college, but were in the city, were the most receptive. They went back to the older generation and explained why this was important. We were able to get some traction with that approach. Today, in terms of advice that I would give the DNC about how to approach this nationally, API households living in suburbs outside major metropolitan areas, in Dallas and in Atlanta in particular, with the rest of those congressional districts, maybe even those statewide maps, are definitely persuadable households to activate. The more Asian Americans begin to vote, the more they'll matter to power, and the more that you'll actually get laws being written to consider those constituencies.
So when you say have the potential to activate, how do you actually activate? Like what factors do you look at to activate?
Yeah, the ladder of engagement there. So just in terms of methodology, you approach it, the way you would approach any kind of, insular minority community. You look for validators in the community to recommend your policy message and your candidate. You would use, advanced and door knocking and digital tools to go there. Language barriers obviously exist with an older generation. That's the standard approach. But again, those three main messages of financial sustainability, kids' education, public safety would be how you do it.
Yes, Mike.
It's interesting because, so just as a rule of thumb, Asian Americans are roughly 20% of California's population, but about 10% of the electorate. So that's sort of the rough rule of thumb, and that played out, I think, in my election. But one thing we found that was highly effective, and it doesn't seem like it would be, it's not that novel of a concept, right? It's basically, you have to talk to people. You have to be communicating with them in some way or another. And we did a significant amount of outreach, a lot of it in language. If we had identified a household, for example, as a Vietnamese-speaking household, and we knew that was an important element of communication, we would communicate with them in language. Same thing, Chinese, Korean, across the state. And it's hard to pin down like what works and what doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of like sticking jello to a wall in this sense, but we just look at the performance of my campaign, for example, in a couple of areas where we know there are significant Asian American populations. And so one example of that is I'll give you a city level example, and I'll give you a congressional district example. So in Katie Porter's congressional district, which is in Southern California, Orange County, I think it's about 30 or 35% Asian, if I recall correctly. The Republican congressional candidate lost that race by 3 or 4 points. President Biden won that seat by, I think, about 10 points. I won that seat by 13. And we know that we did a ton of communication to Asian voters in that district. In a similar way, you look at a single jurisdiction. Some of you might know a city or a town called Hacienda Heights, very close to where I grew up in Southern California. And we spent a lot of time down there. We did a lot of communication there. And I was the first Republican to win Hacienda Heights in 20 years. So we know that communicating with people with a message that is targeted to what they care about and just showing up matters a lot. And granted, it probably also helps to have an Asian American candidate, and that's for all of you in this room who are thinking about running or who will run. That does matter a lot. There are a lot of my Republican friends, that doesn't matter. It's like, no, it matters. It matters a lot. And so you have to be able to look at candidates who look and feel like the areas that they're representing. It's a very kind of intuitive thing, but I think it makes a big difference in politics, and people don't talk about it often enough.
Ken, your experiences.
Let me kind of say this. I want to talk to the high school kids here for a moment, all right? How many of your parents told you, hey, after going to college, I want you to be a politician? Anybody? Right? One, all right? Anybody else? To be an elected leader, right? They want you to be one. a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, all those other things, right? That my parents wanted me to be when we came to this country. They don't say, hey, I want you to run for office. I want you to be an elected leader. They don't tell you that, right? And I think Lonnie mentioned about that for a moment, is this, is how from the 30,000 foot level, the high level here, how do you get more engagement from the API community? You know what it is? We need to have more people stepping up to the plate and running for office. Whether you win, whether you lose, you move the needle in that conversation, right? I didn't have that in terms of when I grew up, but for you guys, in this room, you have a lot of different resources. You have Congresswoman Judy Chu back there, you have our state treasurer, Fiona Mather. These are two trailblazers, right, who run for such high offices. They are the inspiration here when you're looking to run for office, and that's why it's important to have somebody to engage, because when you have somebody who's running for office, you have somebody that you can support, somebody you can reach out to, somebody to rally around, and that's so important. And when we're talking about direct communication, I'll talk a moment in my race. We have in Sacramento County, in other parts, in Fresno, but in other areas, the Hmong community, Southeast Asia. When you look at the Hmong community, they are structured in a community of 18 clans, okay? And they have an 18 counselor. They have somebody that is the head of that clan, who then, if you want to communicate to that community, that clan leader of that particular clan, it could be the Vane clan, they have maybe 20 different lieutenants under them. Under them, they control 10 families, and it goes down. So if you want to communicate, you go directly to that clan leader and the counselor, and then they get that communication down. So when I was sending out my communication, I had somebody that was very focused in that communication, writing in that dialect, because there's several different dialects, and they would send it out to the clan leader, the council, and they would send it down so that they would act in unison. But unless you're in that community, you don't know how that community works, and it's unique as to our community, because there's so many different, ethnicity within our race. And so it's important, but I want to start with the fact that I want to light a fire in each and every one of you, okay? I'm not talking about the elected leader, I'm talking about those that are in high school here. Run for office, go into leadership, make a difference.
I wanted to bring back kind of what Matt was saying, was it's generational. So Lonnie and Tin, when you guys were running your campaigns, were you able to convince those first generation citizens and come out and vote for you and come out and vote for the very first time? And if so, I mean, what was that connection like?
Yeah, I mean, the single biggest factor that gets overlooked in politics, I think, are these sort of generational differences, right? Because there is a large difference when you're communicating with a first generation, recently arrived, let's say, immigrant from mainland China versus someone who's been here, Japanese Americans here for 3 or 4 generations. There's really differences in how you need to communicate with those people and the kinds of. But I find that the kinds of messages that work, there isn't actually a large dispersion, right? I mean, how you approach them and how you talk to them might matter, but the issues I think are fairly similar. And I think that's the only thing probably that encourages me about our politics, given how divided everything is now, is that there is a fair amount of commonality in terms of the issues that people care about, I think. And so when you speak to that, then it almost masks, I think, a lot of those issues. So you're not necessarily narrow casting particularly different messages. Your approach might be different, your language might be different, but the core of the issue and the core of the pitch, I think, is still the same.
When you look at what happened in 2020, and you look at in terms of what was coming from Washington, in terms of the hate, in terms of the focusing on the API community from the pandemic, from China and everything else, it was really a galvanizing moment, I think, for our API community. Because what you saw then was a skyrocketing increase in hate crime against our people. And when you look at that, it's always been high, but underreported. But now it was at the forefront. And people who didn't want to speak up, people who didn't want to get involved, people who didn't want to say anything were now saying something because enough is enough, right? Enough is enough. And I think it was an inflection point in our community is at a crossroad, right? in terms of engagement. And so we saw huge levels of engagement, at least when I was out there in the AAPI community. Sacramento County, for example, we have 1.67 million people in the county. We have, in Elk Grove, it's about 34% AAPI. But there wasn't a lot of engagement. But when you start seeing your elderly, right, beaten and kicked down, when you start seeing the hate speech, right, and you start experiencing that in school, in the workplace, I think it was a moment that galvanized people as well. And so it was sort of, in talking to the community, you just felt that bubbling up. And it was a beautiful thing to see.
I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about our AAPI community in the upcoming 2024 election in the context of what's happening in China, right? We get a lot of negative media. Whether was it yesterday, the Chinese hackers hacked into the US ambassador there. China is a threat to the United States. What's happening in Taiwan? There's a lot of bad things happening. The people, the Chinese Communist Party and the United States are not friends. But unfortunately, people who live in the United States, Asian Americans who live in the United States, have this negative stigma because of what our enemies are doing across the ocean. How does this factor, if any, if at all, play into what you see coming up in the 2024 election, either with candidates or with how people are going to vote, or how do you feel about that issue?
It's definitely a phenomenon happening. How do I approach this question?
It's a big question.
It's a big question. To be sure, in the GOP primary contest, there's going to be quite a lot of national security talk around China and the future of our country relative to, our economic war, potential actual military conflict, so on and so forth. The extent to which a lot of that rhetoric is going to translate down and affect the thinking of Chinese American households about engaging in our political process, is it going to dissuade them from turning out? Are they going to be alienated by all that talk? It isn't clear to me at all. They may not be, in fact. I know that the Democratic Party perhaps practices more identity politics than it should, but we're going to make every effort we can to create an inclusive campaign environment to bring them into a voting, a numeric win pathway on a state-by-state basis. It's a very complex question, for sure.
Lonnie, you have any thoughts on that?
It's hard because what you're trying to do when you run for office is you're trying to create a coalition of people who might disagree on any number of different issues. And I know that there are very deeply held views on the situation between the US and China right now. It's just not, I think for a lot of people, it is in the background, it is there. How you talk about it, what you do, I think it's very important to use the right language when you talk about where our disagreements are. We do have disagreements with certain elements of governing structure in China. We don't have an issue with the people from China. There's all these different things when you're talking about these issues that I think are crucially important. And there's sensitivities that I think are relatively intuitive, maybe, for people who are from Asian American backgrounds and households. Like, you just kind of understand, this is how we want to talk about this is how we want to approach the problem. But what I fear is in our politics, that nuance gets lost. And so you don't find that there's a lot of nuance. There's just, it very quickly becomes the kind of bashing that I think is not helpful. It's not, first of all, it's not constructive to the relationship between the US and China. And it's not constructive to building the kind of coalitions we need to have success here in the US. And so, it's hard. There's no easy answer to your question. There's no silver bullet. You can just be like, oh, just do this and everything will be fine. Because it's not. It's a very tense and difficult relationship for a good reason.
I think it's going to play a part in national elections. You look at the law that was recently passed in Florida in regards to ownership of land and property by somebody who is not a citizen, and in particular, who is a national from China. You look at the legislation that almost passed in Texas, and it's going to come back again. We have to study history to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't especially made again. So I have some concern whether or not some of those issues, I believe, will play in national politics. And so there's an old saying, which is, unless you have a seat at the table, you're going to end up on the menu, right? Unless you have a seat at the table, and I emphasize this, have a voice at the table, you will not only end up on the menu, but you won't get to decide what is on that menu. So you have to have a voice at the table in order to decide what ends up on that menu. And so that's why everywhere I go, and I do a lot of outreach, at least in my community, especially with students, with our young people in the community, about getting involved. Because if you don't speak up, right, other people will frame the narrative for you, and they will paint you in a certain way. And being an API, one of the things that you'll experience is this: is we always are viewed as outsiders and foreigners, right? Whether it's the way we look, our name. I mean, my last name is Ho, right? You look at my last name, you're going to know, that you're going to assume that I'm a foreigner, that I'm Asian, right? So those things come up, and even the implicit bias that you have, and I'll tell you one brief story, and it's a story that I want to inspire you is about maybe 6 years ago, I was the supervisor of our gang team, our hate crime team, and our major narcotic team. I was one of the top people in my office, and I've been there for like 15 years at that point, wearing a suit and tie, walking down the halls of the courtroom. And I had a defense attorney who was white, and as I was coming up, he said to me, "Hey, are you the interpreter?" As I get closer, he keeps yelling, "Are you the interpreter?" And now it's like he doesn't understand. He thinks I don't understand. He starts yelling at me if I'm the interpreter. So I stopped, and I looked at him and I said, "I'm not the effing interpreter. I'm the supervisor of the gang unit." And I just looked at him, and he walked away. And so I emphasize this story because that's why it's important. Again, I keep saying it is, we have to take charge of the narrative and take charge of our lives and our place in society. Because it is going to play a role next year. And we will be used, whether we like it or not, for political purposes. And so we got to take control of that narrative to make sure it doesn't happen.
It's absolutely true. I mean, I think a nuance to that subject is really having both of you guys having run in the past, and everyone who's running for office. Congressmember Chu all of us has been questioned to our loyalty to this country. And the tension with China does not help. So to that effect, can you guys provide some advice for folks who may be interested in running in 2024, 26, anytime in the future? How do you actually, I don't even know, have people in power not question your loyalty to this country? Because we are Americans just like them. And I can't help but think that factor in and of itself really does impede many API candidates. How do you guys feel about that? They question your loyalty and your Americanness.
You know, I think it's different levels, right? So I think on the constitutional statewide level and the national level, I think the loyalty issue is always there. Looking at us as outsiders is always there. There's also a perception of Asian Americans that we are better workers than we are leaders. I mean, I experienced that personally myself in my own field when my predecessor, when I was thinking about running, said I wasn't ready, even though I've been promoted by her multiple times. And so you look at that approach there, right? There's a lot of things working against us. And just because they're working against us, you know what, doesn't break you, make you stronger, right? And so, you know, the advice that I would have is this, is don't let anybody deter you. When you're thinking about running for office, you know, trying to get endorsements, and even as an elected official, endorsements don't matter that much. To be honest with you, in my opinion, you know, don't let those things stop you, okay? have a dream and a vision and go after it. And you know, and Lonnie can talk about it, and Matt being in politics can talk about it as well, but you have to have a vision within yourself and what it is that you're willing to do at the end of the day. And people will always put up obstacles, especially the obstacles that we have from our own community, the obstacles that we have from our own family, from our own culture, beyond the other things. But until we get that needle to move, until we are willing to take a risk, it's never going to change. You have to be willing to take a risk.
Matt, working in this area, do you sense that when you have, as a GC, when you have a client who may not look like everyone else, do you sense that they work from a deficit a little bit more?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've actually run two Chinese American candidates for office. One was successful, one wasn't. Yeah, they definitely had to confront being otherized by a white majority electorate. They did find identity and a pathway, a numerical pathway to winning out of their community originally. It did take work with API candidates, by the way. There wasn't just a natural turning the key with API households that just because I'm an Asian candidate, I'm going to get Asian votes. That didn't happen. Easier with Latino candidates, easier with African American candidates. But I mean, at a certain point, there is a sort of a multidimensional, multicultural coalition is formed up. And I think a lot of that otherizing does abate at a certain point. But it is an insecurity. It's very palpable early days with the candidate, for sure. Yeah.
Can I say one thing I forgot real quick? So, my name is Tin Ho. Tin Ho, right? That's an unusual name. So there were questions about whether or not I could get elected with just that name. But I'll tell you this, you'll never forget that last name, Ho, right? You can always win with Tin, right? So there are things you can do and take advantage of who you are, right? There's the uniqueness there. So even I was questioning whether or not I was electable just on my name alone. Just think about that a moment, right? You can always turn any name, you can turn what, lemon into lemonade?
Well, our time is running out, so before I let our distinguished guests go, I'd love to just have each of you give your lasting thoughts for 2024 and what to look for.
Yeah, so, in terms of the API voting community nationally, there's a real opportunity to make API votes matter. Every cycle presents an opportunity. I think this one's a big one. So, whatever we can do to support API candidates, whatever we can do to create engagement, this is an awesome time to do it.
I mean, running for office is not a safe thing to do, right? And so I think there'll be a lot of voices in your head, or people who you talk to, who you trust, and people in your family who might say, this is the Tim's point, like, maybe you shouldn't do it. And there are a lot of reasons to not do it. I don't disagree with that at all. And you have to make sure it works for your life situation. But I do think that I think you get a lot out of the process. When you run and you put yourself through something like that, you learn a lot. You learn a lot about, I was saying, people say, oh, how was it? It's like, well, you learn a lot about yourself too. You learn a lot about yourself and about the process and about what it means to participate in our democracy in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. So I think my encouragement would be, I hope people will consider it. And I hope they'll think carefully about it, because it is one of those things where you really accelerate your understanding of the process, but also how other people see you and see our community as well. So I think it's a good thing to do.
This is my message. This is our time. This is our time.
Wonderful. Please join me.